Have you been looking for the secret to making perfect mitered corners on your borders? Whether you're working on a quilt block or an entire quilt, mitered corners can be really easy. Hi, this is Penny Hallgren from howtoquilt.com. Today I'm going to do a demonstration showing you exactly how to sew mitered corners on borders as you add them to your quilt block or your entire quilt. The first stop is the cutting table, so let's get started. This is the block that I'm going to be working with, and I decided that I wanted to add a border that was going to be about 1 inch wide. And so I've cut a border strip here that's 1.5 inches wide, so that'll take into account the seam allowance. So the next thing I want to do is measure this block, and this is the actual size of the block, and it's about 11.5 inches. So I'm going to need border strips that are going to be 11.5 inches long, plus the width of my unfinished size border on the top and the bottom. So I need 4 strips that are at least 14.5 inches long. And I'm probably going to cut them a little bit longer than 14.5 inches. I'll probably cut them about 16 inches just to make sure that I have enough. Now I've got my 4 border strips cut, and these are each 16 inches long. The next thing I want to do is find the center of these strips. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I want to add my border strips so that I make sure that I'm squaring up the block. And what that means is I'm going to measure on my border strips exactly the width of the block and the height of the block and pin that on the strips so that I'm not doing any stretching as I'm adding these border strips. Now that my border strips are marked, I've got the center and each one of the sides. I'm just going to take one of these and pin it to the side of my block. Now what I'm going to need to do is find the center of my block. So I'm going to do that by folding this over and just finger press the center. I'm going to open that up and I can see the crease, and then I'll lay my strip down on top of it. The yellow line is going to mark the edge of this border, or is going to mark the edge of the block. And what I want to do is stop my stitching 1/4 of an inch in from that. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now I'm going to turn my block around. I'm going to move this out of the way, and then I'm going to do the same thing with my second border strip. I like to work with just 2 sides at a time, so I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and sew these 2 onto the block. As I sew this on, what I want to do is make sure that I start 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of my block or the edge of your quilt top. I usually do not backstitch, but I do a couple of stitches in place just so the stitching doesn't come out. And then I'll just stitch all the way down the side here using 1/4 of an inch, and I'll stop when I get to 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the block on the bottom side. So I'm just going to open this up, and then I'm going to start stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the block here, which actually is going to be where this is folded. I'll take a couple of stitches in place and then sew all the way down the second side of this block, stopping 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the block. And now I'm going to open this up. Now I need to mark my stitching line from this corner down to the edge of the border, and I need to be sewing at a 45-degree angle. The first thing I want to do is line up my edges that are extending beyond the block, and the easiest way to make sure that everything is still lined up and flat and you're going to get both sides even is to fold the block in half, or the quilt in half, so that the right side is facing out and that you've got your edges of your quilt top of your block extending down this side. You need to have a ruler that has 45-degree angle line on it. So what I'll do is line up my 45-degree angle on my ruler with the edge of the border, and put the edge of the ruler right there at the end of my stitching, and then take my marker and draw a line. Now that I have my mark is I'm going to take a pin. Actually, I'm going to take 2 pins and put those in. And then I'm going to stitch this closed. Now where I'm going to start is where my stitching ended. So I'm going to put my sewing machine needle right in there and then stitch on the right side of that line. Before I trim all of this off, I'm going to add the rest of the borders and press it. And once I have it pressed, then I'll trim this edge off at the 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I'm ready to iron the mitered corners. And I'm going to just start with one corner here and fold it open and then press it down. So I'm going to fold that down that way and then I'm going to press it. And this time I'm going to press into the corner. Now that I have all the sides pressed and the corners are all flat and they look pretty good, I'm ready to trim the excess off of each one of these corners. So I'm just going to take my scissors and then trim it with my scissors. And once I've done that, then I'll repress that corner just to make sure that it's flat and trim this little triangle tip off. Our Iowa barn block now has a border on it with mitered corners. Whether you're adding borders to a large quilt or a small block and you want to miter the corners, the process is still the same. I hope this has been instructional and helpful for you. Thanks for joining me. This is Penny Hallgren from howtoquilt.com signing off. Happy quilting!